You're in the plane and you know it's going down. The engines are sputtering, the metal groans, and the trees below are getting closer, fast. One survivor later said, "We hit the tops of the trees. It started soft, then got so loud until it just crashed." New heartbreaking details have emerged about the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, the 1977 tragedy that silenced one of America's greatest rock bands and reshaped music history forever. What once appeared to be an unfortunate accident now seems like something much darker. A perfect storm of preventable errors, an avoidable disaster born from fatigue, faith, and fame colliding at 10,000 feet. Tonight, we revisit the night when Southern rock fell silent and uncover how a series of overlooked warnings, human mistakes, and eerie premonitions sealed the fate of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Let's unveil the full truth behind the crash that changed rock and roll forever. It was the evening of October 20th, 1977, when tragedy struck one of America's most beloved Southern rock bands, Lynyrd Skynyrd. Just 3 days earlier, they had released their fifth studio album, Street Survivors, a record brimming with passion, swagger, and the raw spirit that defined their sound. The band was riding a new wave of success. Songs like Free Bird and A Sweet Home Alabama had turned them into legends, and their tour schedule was packed with sold-out shows across the country. But as they boarded a Convair CV-240, a twin-engine propeller plane built in 1947, fate had already written its cruel ending. The aircraft was over 30 years old, leased from a small Texas company called L&J. It was cheap, convenient, but unsafe. In fact, earlier that same year, Aerosmith's management had inspected this very plane for a possible lease. They rejected it immediately after witnessing one of the pilots drinking during the evaluation. That chilling detail alone might have been enough to stop most people. But Lynyrd Skynyrd pressed on. The tour was relentless. From Greenville, South Carolina, the band was heading to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they were set to perform the next night at Louisiana State University. There were 26 people on board, band members, road crew, backup singers, and flight staff. Among them, Ronnie Van Zant, the charismatic frontman whose voice defined an era. Guitarists Gary Rossington, Steve Gaines, and Alan Collins. Bassist Leon Wilkson, keyboardist Billy Powell, and drummer Artemus Pyle. Backing vocalists Cassie Gaines, JoJo Billingsley, and Leslie Hawkins. The trio known as the Honkettes were also there. So was Cassie's brother, guitarist Steve Gaines, whose talent was lighting up the stage that very tour. But not everyone wanted to fly that night. Concerns had been growing for weeks. On a flight from Lakeland, Florida, just a day earlier, some band members had watched in terror as sparks and flames burst from the right engine. Cassie Gaines, frightened beyond words, begged not to board the plane again. She even considered traveling with the band's equipment truck instead. But Ronnie Van Zant, ever the stoic leader, refused to change plans. "If it's your time to go," he said quietly, "it's your time to go." Those words would become hauntingly prophetic. The skies were clear when the conveyor lifted off from Greenville around 5:56 p.m. For most of the flight, everything seemed fine. Calm skies, laughter in the cabin, and the comforting sense that they were just hours from their next show. But 3 hours later, the nightmare began. About 3 hours into the flight, the mood shifted from a lighthearted to deadly serious. The pilots, Captain Walter McCreary and First Officer William Gray, suddenly noticed something terrifying. The fuel gauges were dropping far faster than expected. At first, they thought it must be a mechanical error. After all, the flight log showed that they had more than enough fuel to reach Baton Rouge. But within minutes, the right engine began to sputter, then failed completely. Desperate to keep the aircraft airborne, the crew attempted a risky maneuver known as cross-feeding, trying to transfer fuel from the left tank to the right. But instead of saving the plane, that decision doomed it. In a tragic twist of fate, the valve they operated had vented the remaining fuel into the atmosphere, draining both tanks dry. Now both engines were silent. The once thundering Convair CV-240 became a gliding coffin, descending helplessly through the cold Mississippi night. At 10,000 feet, the pilots radioed for an emergency landing at Macomb Pike County Airport, but it was already clear they wouldn't make it. Below them, endless forests stretched into darkness. No runway, no open fields, only miles of pine trees waiting like spears. Inside the cabin, panic erupted. Some passengers screamed, others prayed. A few sat frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Amid the chaos, Ronnie Van Zant, who had been napping toward the rear of the plane, remained eerily calm. One survivor recalled he just seemed ready, like he knew. At 6:52 p.m., Captain McCreary spotted a narrow clearing near Gillsburg, Mississippi, a small rural town surrounded by swamp and forest. It was their only chance. He aimed for the field, dropping the landing gear to slow descent. Seconds later, the Convair clipped the tops of pine trees at 90 miles per hour. The fuselage ripped apart as branches shredded through the wings. Metal screamed. Darkness filled with sparks and splintered wood. The plane skidded nearly 500 feet before coming to a violent stop in the muddy swamp. Silence followed, a silence broken only by cries for help. The crash claimed 6 lives instantly. Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and both pilots, McCreary and Gray. The other 20 survived, many with shattered bones, collapsed lungs, and unimaginable trauma. But survival would be its own kind of torment. Night fell over the swampy woods of Gillsburg, Mississippi, and the wreckage lay scattered across hundreds of feet of broken trees and twisted metal. Rescue crews from nearby Macomb and Magnolia raced toward the crash site, but the dense forest and marshy terrain made reaching the survivors nearly impossible. Helicopters couldn't land and ambulances got stuck in the mud. For hours, the only sounds were the cries of the wounded echoing through the dark. Drummer Artemis Pyle, his ribs broken and face covered in blood, managed to crawl out of the wreckage with 2 crew members. They stumbled through the pitch-black woods, desperate to find help. When they finally reached a nearby farmhouse, the owner, Johnny Moat, a local dairy farmer, mistook them for trespassers. He fired a warning shot, grazing Pyle's shoulder before realizing the truth. These weren't intruders, they were survivors. Within hours, rescue teams swarmed the crash site. Bodies were pulled from the swamp, and the injured were carried out on makeshift stretchers. Miraculously, the absence of a post-crash fire caused by the total fuel loss prevented even greater loss of life. Survivors were airlifted to hospitals in Macomb, Jackson, and Baton Rouge, many in critical condition. The scene, as one paramedic described, was like something out of a war zone. When the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, arrived, they faced an eerie sight. There was no explosion, no fire, just wreckage and silence. Investigators began piecing together the puzzle of what went wrong. By June 1978, the NTSB released its final report. The cause of the crash was fuel exhaustion, brought on by crew mismanagement, inadequate flight planning, and minor mechanical issues that increased fuel consumption. The report ruled out weather or engine failure. Both engines were found intact, though completely dry. And most haunting of all, it confirmed that the crew, in trying to correct a simple imbalance, had accidentally dumped the last of their fuel into the air. One wrong lever pull, one human mistake, was all it took to end 6 lives and silence one of rock's greatest voices. But the tragedy didn't stop there. For those who survived, the nightmare had only begun. In the chaotic aftermath of the crash, the surviving members of Lynyrd Skynyrd were rushed to hospitals across Mississippi and Louisiana. Their injuries were devastating, but the emotional scars would run even deeper. Gary Rossington, the band's guitarist, suffered 2 broken arms, a broken leg, and internal injuries that nearly claimed his life. Allen Collins endured severe damage to his shoulder and arm, coming dangerously close to amputation. Billy Powell, the band's keyboardist, was left with deep facial lacerations, almost losing his nose. Artemis Pyle, despite several broken ribs and a bullet wound from the earlier misunderstanding, became the band's living witness, the man who literally crawled through the woods to save lives. Leslie Hawkins and Gene Odom barely survived, carrying permanent reminders of that horrific night. Just 3 days before the tragedy, Street Survivors had been released, its original album cover showing the band engulfed in flames. After the crash, the image felt too hauntingly prophetic. The record label immediately withdrew the cover out of respect for the victims. The crash ended the original Lynyrd Skynyrd lineup forever. For a while, it seemed like the story of the band had come to an end too. But even through heartbreak and pain, the survivors' resilience refused to fade. In 1979, Rossington and Collins reunited with several former members to form the Rossington-Collins Band. Their music carried the same Southern soul, but the joy was gone, replaced by the weight of memory. The band released 2 albums before disbanding, haunted by the ghosts of the past. Then in 1987, exactly a decade after the crash, Lynyrd Skynyrd rose again. The surviving members reunited for a tribute tour, joined by Ronnie Van Zant, Ronnie's younger brother, who took on the role of lead vocalist. The audience wept as Johnny sang his brother's songs, his voice carrying the same Southern grit and emotion. From that moment, the legacy of Lynyrd Skynyrd was reborn. The tribute tour became permanent. Albums followed, tours sold out, and the legend lived on. But tragedy would continue to shadow them. Allen Collins was paralyzed in a 1986 car accident that took the life of his girlfriend. He spent his remaining years confined to a wheelchair before passing away in 1990 from complications of the pneumonia. Leon Wilkeson, the band's bassist, died in 2001 at age 49. Billy Powell passed away in 2009, and Gary Rossington, the last surviving founding member, died on March 5, 2023, at the age of 71. When Rossington's heart finally stopped, fans around the world knew the final chapter of the original Lynyrd Skynyrd had closed. Yet the music never died. Nearly half a century has passed since that dark October evening in 1977, yet the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash still echoes through the heart of American music. The official NTSB report remains unchanged. The crash was caused by fuel exhaustion and crew error, but over the decades, new insights have emerged, adding depth and heartbreak to the story. Aviation experts now believe that the plane's right engine may have been running on an auto-rich fuel mixture, a setting that floods the engine with excess fuel for cooling during high-performance phases. This would have caused the right engine to burn fuel at a much higher rate, explaining why survivors saw sparks and brief bursts of flame from the exhaust on previous flights. The pilots, unaware of this imbalance, trusted faulty gauges, a fatal mistake that slowly drained their final chance at survival. But the mechanical failures tell only part of the story. The human element, the pressure, fatigue, and blind faith, was equally responsible. The band's intense tour schedule allowed no breaks. Canceling a show could mean losing thousands of dollars and disappointing fans across the South. Under that kind of pressure, even experienced pilots might convince themselves to keep flying, despite every warning light flashing red. Drummer Artemis Pyle, one of the few still alive to tell the tale, has often recalled those final moments in vivid detail. In interviews decades later, his voice still trembles when he describes the sound of the engines dying, the cries from the cabin, and the eerie calm that fell before impact. He remembers looking out the window and seeing pine trees rising to meet them. He remembers Ronnie Van Zant asleep in the back, peaceful, as if somehow he already knew what was coming. The film Street Survivors, the true story of the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, would later bring these memories to a new generation, a dramatized but deeply emotional retelling that kept the band's legacy alive. Today, Lynyrd Skynyrd's music still plays in bars, on radios, and in the hearts of fans everywhere. Songs like Free Bird and Simple Man carry a different weight now. They're not just Southern rock anthems, they're echoes of dreams cut short, of lives that ended too soon, and of the resilience of those who refuse to let tragedy silence their spirit. The crash of October 20th, 1977, was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point, a story of human error, yes, but also of courage, sacrifice, and legacy. A reminder that even in loss, music has the power to live forever. And that is the story that still haunts the skies of Mississippi. The night when a legendary band fell from the heavens and the spirit of Southern rock was forever changed. If this story moved you, remember, behind every song, every note, and every lyric, there are lives, dreams, and sacrifices we often never see. The crash of Lynyrd Skynyrd's Convair CV-240 wasn't just a tragic headline. It was a symbol of what it means to chase greatness, to live hard, to love fiercely, and to risk everything for the music that defines who you are. Even now, nearly 50 years later, their voices still echo through the guitars, through the songs, through the hearts of those who listen. Free Bird still flies, Sweet Home Alabama still plays, and somewhere, maybe beyond the clouds, Ronnie Van Zant and still sings. If you found this story as powerful as we did, take a moment to honor their memory. Hit the like button, leave a comment about what Lynyrd Skynyrd means to you, and subscribe so you never miss another story of music, legacy, and fate. Because the more we remember, the more they live on. And if you think this was emotional, wait until you see the next video on your screen. It's a story you won't believe.